Dr. Ronis, and you can get started.
Wonderful. So I have shared a source sheet in the chat. I'm also going to share my screen, but I know some people like to see it yourself, so you should be able to open it if you are one of the people who likes to have it open yourself. So I wanted to start with just a word of grounding because I know it's the morning here, at least for me in San Antonio, and so why are we doing this? And the Aruch HaShulchan states the following, and the custom, talking about the laws of mourning, the custom is to learn Mishnah both for the first 12 months and on the day of the Yahrzeit for their souls. And this is a great remedy for their soul because Mishnah, which in Hebrew is spelled with the 4 letters I put in the source sheet, has the same letters as neshama, or soul, in Hebrew. And so I hope and I pray that the learning we're doing today is strengthening for the souls of those who were murdered, and for the souls of everyone who needs comfort and safety and peace in our world today. So what I want to study with you in our little time together is a couple of Mishnahs from Tractate Moed Katan. Moed Katan is the tractate which presents the laws of Chol HaMoed, the intermediate days of a 7-day holiday. So on Sukkot, which is coming up, we will have 2 days of, at least in the diaspora, we will have 2 days of intense holiday at the beginning and 2 days of intense holiday at the end. And in the middle, we will have some intermediate days where the holiday is still enacted, but a little less intense. And Mishnah Moed Katan teaches us what we can do on those intermediate days and what you can't. And this is a powerful set of laws because the 3rd chapter of Moed Katan tells us what kinds of mourning we can and cannot do on the intermediate days. Now, what's interesting is that the Mishnah actually doesn't have a tractate about the laws of mourning. So most of the laws of mourning in Jewish tradition are found in this, or at least the origins, because they develop afterwards, are found in this set of Mishnahs. Because it turns out that in teaching us what is forbidden on the intermediate days, on Chol HaMoed, we can actually learn a lot about what was required, permitted, and customary when it wasn't Chol HaMoed, or the intermediate days. At least in 2nd century Roman Palestine. And so these, what I love about a day of mourning, I hate that we have to have one, but what I love about a day of learning is that, we went from a wonderful talk by Rabbi Held about some really high level moral issues. And now we're going to look really technically at what mourning looked like for one kind of community in the 2nd century in the land of Israel, and really get some powerful insights on how they built and practiced mourning. So let's look at the Mishnah. And it's hard for me to see. There's a lot of people here, so I can't really monitor the chat. But if there's a question while we're going, feel free to interrupt me. My Jewish learning administrators.
I'll pull out questions if I see them.
Awesome, great, especially about comprehension. All right. So again, let's just remind ourselves, we learn about what we do the rest of the year by them telling us what you can't do on the intermediate days of a holiday. So let's jump in. Mourners do not rend their garments during the intermediate days of the festival and do not remove their garments from their shoulders. So the act of tearing your clothing or otherwise changing your mode of dress is not done on the intermediate days, which tells us that the rest of the time, there are these ceremonial ripping of garments and removing of garments. And others do not provide them with a meal after the burial, except for close relatives of the deceased. So again, the rest of the time after the burial, people in your community, your broader community, not just your close relatives, bring you a meal. And the consolers provide the first meal only on an upright bed. So traditionally, the bed would be overturned. You would be sitting on an upside down bed. And here, you wouldn't. And just to note here, I think about this today. We often, if you go to a house of mourning, people sit on low chairs. That's the same sort of model of the overturned bed. Our furniture is not um, the same when we are in mourning, which again makes me think of some of the awful images of the ways that people whose communities were attacked, the pictures of the furniture, and how it was all overturned. All right, let's keep going. One does not bring the first meal to the house of mourning on a small tray or a bowl or a narrow-mouthed basket, but in ordinary baskets. And the mourner's blessing is not recited on the intermediate days of the festival, but the consolers may stand in a row and console them, and the mourners dismiss the many. So what they're describing here is, as you leave the cemetery for burial, what would happen is the community would line up in a row, and they would bless the mourner and then console them as they walk out of the cemetery. And the mourner would say, okay, thank you so much. You can go home now, right? They have to be dismissed. You can't just walk away from a mourner. You have to be dismissed. And so that's what they're describing here, this very ritualized, communally oriented description of how you leave the cemetery as the mourner, how you leave the cemetery as those who come to console the mourner, and then how you reintegrate into a body that needs to eat food, right? Who brings you the food? What is the food like? All of those pieces. The buyer, and just as in this period, people would be buried, probably carried in some sort of very, like on a pallet, but then wrapped only in something very simple. The buyer is not set down in the street on the intermediate days so as not to encourage eulogies. So apparently in the 2nd century, people would carry the deceased through the town on the way to the burial, and they would put down the pallet somewhere in the center of town, and people could come up spontaneously and eulogize the deceased. And apparently you don't do that when it's a holiday. And the biers of women are never set down due to their honor. Something about public eulogies with the body just there, apparently the Mishnah thinks is dishonorable for women. Perhaps if the sheet slips, perhaps if the body is in the process of decay, it doesn't quite tell us. On the intermediate days of a festival, women may wail, but they may not clap. Rabbi Yishmael says those who are close to the bier may clap. So just to note here, there are a series of actions that women are described as doing at a funeral. One is wailing, another is clapping. And I think here we don't want to think about clapping as applause as much as perhaps a beating of the breast or a mode of almost self-harm in mourning. Let's keep going, and then I'm going to pull it all together. On new moons, Hanukkah and Purim, they may wail and clap, right? These are different kinds of holidays than Sukkot and Passover. On both the intermediate days of a festival and new moons, Hanukkah and Purim, they may not lament. All right, wailing and clapping are okay, lamenting is not. After the deceased has been buried, they may neither wail nor clap, right? This moment, this outcry of this deep and powerful grief ends when the person is buried. Now you might ask yourself, what's the difference between wailing and lamenting? Great question. The Mishnah asks the same one. What is considered wailing? When they all wail together. And what is considered a lament? This is when one speaks and they all answer after her, as it is stated, and teach your daughters wailing, and everyone her neighbor lamentation. So some kind of one person speaks and the other people respond. That would be a call and response. So the wailing, the communal singing, mourning together is permitted on these days. But they may not do the call and response kind of. Let's stop there, and we'll come back to it, I promise, because I want to make sure that we have the time to really talk about these. So I want to note a couple of things about how Mishnah Moed Katan lays out mourning. So the first thing I just want to highlight is that the mourning here is profoundly ritualized. Right, profoundly ritualized. It's not we're sad and we do what we feel like doing. It's ritualized. Everything from how you walk the body, right, the body through the town, to where you put it down, to where the mourner stands and where the community stands, is all highly structured. And that structure is powerful because it means you don't have to think about it, right? And I think about this. Jewish tradition is based in this Mishnah, but has continued to evolve over 2,000 years. So this may not sound like exactly the mourning practices today that we might be familiar with. But I'll note that I still think, whenever I have friends who are part of traditions where mourning isn't ritualized and they are mourning a loss, there's this moment where they have to make all of these decisions, right? They have to make all about what the funeral is going to look like, about what kind of mourning they're going to do. And that is the last time in the world that you want to spend making decisions. And the Mishnah says you don't have to make any decisions. It's all structured so that you don't have to think about any of it. It's just set. Now, the flip side of structure is that it's also limited. It follows a set list of rituals that are contained, right? There are ways that we mourn in certain moments, and then we are not supposed to mourn that way forever. To build on what Rabbi Held said, perhaps, to note that mourning cannot take over our life, that we have these very set moments for extreme mourning that may even manifest in self-harm, non-permanent self-harm, but that those moments have a time and a place, and then that time and place are over. I also want to note here that mourning is profoundly contextual in the Mishnah. And I mean that here both in the sense of the context of a community. It's not something that the Mishnah describes somebody doing alone, but instead doing in a community that might include close relatives, but then also includes a broader community who participate in comforting you. Mourning is contextual in the sense of gender in the Mishnah. If you've studied Mishnah or any rabbinic literature, you know that the Mishnah in general and rabbinic literature has a very strong understanding of different genders having different laws and practices that are incumbent upon them. And so here we see the ways that mourning is gendered, both in terms of who gets public eulogies in the middle of the street and who perhaps gets more private eulogies, and then also in the sense of who is allowed or customary to express the deepest pain of mourning, right? The fact that it's women who are often actually in the ancient world hired. They would, right, today you might pay a rabbi to give a eulogy. They would pay women to be professional mourners, to create the space for this kind of wailing and clapping and lamenting for the community as a whole. And it's also profound, right? Mourning is also profoundly contextual. And contextual here, I mean in the sense of the context of the calendar. So you may be in profound moments of grief, and you are still deeply connected to the Jewish calendar, to the idea that whatever is going on in your life, it is still Sukkot, or it is still Chol HaMoed, or it is still Hanukkah, and that matters, that your grief is important, but it is important within a world in which time continues to move and continues to be meaningful. I think we also see here how mourning has aspects that are profoundly private. The Mishnah doesn't talk about what what the mourner is feeling, about the sadness. I think anyone here who has experienced profound mourning knows it's really hard to put that into words. But they do note the ways that that private feeling is embedded in a public context, and that your private feeling is surrounded by a community that is working for you. And so mourning is in many ways a set of relationships, with the dead and with the living, with the calendar, with our community, with our city, and that all of those are happening at the same time. So, when I think about all of this, it's a really powerful reminder that the rabbis um, can hold more than one thing at the same time. Right? That the rabbis can walk and chew gum at the same time. That they can both note the way that mourning is profoundly private and rooted in a broader community. That they can both note that they are um, feelings of grief that can take you over, and insist that we have to limit those in particular ways in order to move forward. So I want to, we have plenty of time for questions. I didn't know how long that was going to take. So if there are questions, I'm happy to take some. I'd love to know what you think about these Mishnahs as we're doing this. I will just note, I saw a question about the dismissal of the mourner. So let me go back and share the screen again so we can all make sure we understand what we're saying. Now, where is that? I have too many tabs up. Okay. So what they're noting is that so on Chol HaMoed, on those intermediate days, so when it's not Chol HaMoed, on a regular day, the community would line up to escort the mourners out of the cemetery. They would recite a blessing and offer words of consolation. And then the mourners would say, you can go home. Thank you. And here they're noting that so on Chol HaMoed, you can do everything except say the blessing. So you're still lining up in rows to console the mourner as they leave the cemetery. But you're right. So you're doing many of the communal pieces. You're just not saying the blessing. I hope that helped. Are there questions or comments or thoughts? I know many people here have had our own experiences of mourning, whether it is for October 7th, for our own loved ones, for our own communities. And I'd love to know what you think about this text in light of those experiences as well. You can put anything in the chat.
While we're waiting for questions, maybe I'll just address one question that I've seen come up a few times is, why are we having this day of learning on the English date, English calendar date of October 7th instead of the Hebrew date, when technically that's the yard site and that is when learning Mishnah is supposed to take place. And Sarah, you might have your own answer. I'll say from my Jewish learning perspective, the anniversary date is a Chag, and so we won't be working that day. We won't be able to host this. And I think just by the number of people here, it's obvious there's a real need to do something today, in particular on the English calendar date. So that's why we are hosting this today. I don't know.
Yes, and as someone who doesn't use electronics on the holidays, I was grateful that you chose to do it on the English calendar, because it meant that I could come and learn with all of you. And, I need that as much as anyone else. So absolutely.
I see a question, Dr. Ronis. Are there limits on what or who can be mourned?
Yes. are there limits on what and who can be mourned? So the Mishnah is specifically talking about mourning Jews who um, who are related to you. Now, we know today that there are lots of other kinds of relationships in the world, both with other humans and with the non-human living creatures around us. So today, many religious traditions um, have developed all kinds of rituals for mourning the loss of those members of our community who might not be Jewish, or those members of our households that might not be human. I'm thinking here of pets in particular, not like ghosts. Those are more modern innovations than the rabbis of the Mishnah, which is a 2nd century, 3rd century text. But absolutely, and when people are trying to figure out what more expansive rituals might look like, they go back to some of these source texts. Absolutely. I want to note a couple of other pieces that I'm seeing here. You know, one is this question of cross-cultural boundaries around mourning. And I'll note here that these are the kinds of problems or challenges that emerge when we are a profoundly interconnected community. On the one hand, that causes its own challenges, but I think it's a feature, not a bug. I think the fact that we have these questions because we care about each other, because we want to mourn cross-culturally, to me is a sign of strength, not a weakness. I want to note here that there are a number of questions about what does this have to do with perhaps retribution, and what I would note is nothing. That this Mishnah is about the feelings of mourning. It's not discussing in any way how people died. And we know that people died by violence in the ancient world. This set of Mishnahs is specifically building out a moment of just sorrow, of how a person should be taken care of in moments of really deep mourning by their community and by their family. So this text does not say anything about what you might call retribution. I'm seeing other people in the chat suggest it's more like justice. Whatever you want to talk about what happens next, the Mishnah here is insisting that there is a time and a place and a way to mourn, and that time and place and way is profoundly structured, and I will also just say profoundly Jewish, right? That this highly rabbinic structure, and I'll even note in the Mishnah, let me go up just one bit, right? It's even profoundly structured in that we have within the laws of mourning a machloket, a disagreement between two rabbis about dealing with these two different, right, whether or not you can clap, right? So it's profoundly Jewish, even in the sense that we have our 2 Jews, 3 opinions in our laws of mourning. We have time maybe for one more question. And I'll just note here that Deborah noted, and I think this is beautiful, that grief is cyclical and ebbs and flows with time. Sometimes these bookends eclipse this human process, leaving one mourning or re-mourning in silence and feeling alone. And thoughts, please, right? I'm not referring here to unresolved chronic grief. And so let me note, I think that there is a degree of continuous grief, which is not healthy for a person, and which we, thank God, today have all kinds of resources to help us deal with. And but I also think that the mourning piece is more, you're right? That's the danger of structure, right? The danger of structure is that it does not allow for, you walk into somebody else's house and for whatever reason their foyer smells exactly like your lost loved one, even though it's 7 years later, and you're back in the moment of Shiva all of a sudden, right? Or whatever that might be for you, right? And so you're absolutely right that this structure can bring us comfort, but it does not account for the fullness of the human experience. Perhaps it can't. Perhaps no structure can account for the fullness of human experience. And so there's a tension there. There's a tension there. I want to just honor and name that. We have 2 minutes left, and I want to make sure that, like the Mishnah, I end us on a little bit of a different note. Right, the Mishnah, really importantly, as you study the Mishnah never likes to end on a downer. At the end of every tractate, it likes to give us some words of hope, and this is the end of Tractate Moed Katan, and so we just described, who can wail and clap or lament in mourning, and the Mishnah ends like this: but with regard to the future, the verse states, he will destroy death forever, and the Lord God will wipe away tears from off all faces, and the reproach of his people he will take away from all of the earth. Right? The Mishnah ends by telling us, here are the laws of mourning now, but there will come a time where we do not have to practice them anymore, where in fact we will have, all those who mourn will be comforted, that those who cry will have their tears wiped away, and not by, a parent or a spouse or a child, but by God's self. And that the people of the world will come together in support, right? In support of those who've mourned. And I think that's a really powerful place to end. I think that's a really hopeful place to end. I wish that come to pass speedily in our days. And with that, I'll turn it back to my Jewish learning.